I think we are live. Yes.
And it looks like we're live on LinkedIn. Welcome everybody today who has joined us for the second event in our Highako Credit Captains Conference 2022. This is a second event of the day for Wednesday. And we've got a phenomenal panel here of folks. And we've got Dave Schmidt, who's going to be moderating it. And I'll pass it off to you, Dave, to see who's coming on board and get the ball rolling.
Well, are we waiting for the top of the hour?
Well, I think we've got a few minutes to go, but I think we're already live on LinkedIn. So we've got a couple minutes before we actually our official start time.
Well, we're glad to have everybody join us today. And I'm excited for what we're going to learn from this panel. We've got Chris Kuehl and Paul Hill with us, as well as Pam Crank, and we'll give them a full introduction later. But we're going to be talking about securing transactions, mitigating credit risk, and there's with recent news and everything going on, and the chance for a recession seemingly increasing every day. These need to be part of the game plan for credit professionals and anybody managing a B2B credit portfolio. So I think this topic is very timely.
Again, San Antonio 177 is now boarding at HC 67.
Oh, we also have the Denver Airport as a panelist.
Pardon me?
The Denver Airport is also a panelist today, joining us in the background.
Yeah, unfortunately, I apologize for that ahead of time. So those of you who really miss the experience of being in an airport and like to relive it from the comfort of your home, that's my job. So you'll get to hear, if there's a gate change announcement, just be aware it's not you. It's not you. You don't have to change. So.
I kind of like it live, Chris, because normally
there you go.
Escapades in airports, so that's kind of a treat.
Yeah, there you go. Any minute, it's whatever. It's like flying is if you've given a choice between smacking yourself in the head with a ball peen hammer or flying, choose the ball peen hammer. It's going to be more pleasant. So.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. And if you're considering changing careers to go into the transportation industry from credit, we recommend highly that you stay in credit.
Oh, absolutely. As you can see by Paul's background, he tried to go into transportation and they sent him to prison.
Stay in credit and you'll be dealing with the transportation industry rather shortly, if history is a good indicator.
Yeah, exactly.
What do they call it? Chapter 23 or 33 or 43 if you're having your second, third, fourth go around in the court.
No, they'll just announce that the bankruptcy has been delayed or possibly canceled. So that's
right.
Yeah.
Reroute it.
They'll just declare it too big to fail.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
True enough.
So we're coming up to the top of the hour, so we'll get started with the formal presentation in just a moment. Bear with us, and thank you for joining.
And I will stay on mute until I need to talk, so you don't get all the background noise.
Thank you, Paul. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I'd like to welcome everybody. Hello. This is the first episode of Credit Captains Conference 2022, a 3-day virtual event where over 20 global credit leaders will help you steer your credit teams through the current economic downturn. My name is Dave Schmidt, and I'll be a moderator for today's discussion. I'm Managing Director of A2 Resources and O2C and Order to Cash Consultancy, and I'm a contributing editor with Credit Today. So as with all these webinars, online webinars, we have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So this will be an interactive panel discussion. If you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A section or the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen or the bottom of your screen, however you have it set up. These questions will be answered by the end of the presentation. Everybody who registers will receive a copy of this session recording with the next couple of days via email. So I'd like to start by introducing Highako University, and the Credit Captains Conference is in conjunction with Highako University. It's the world's first micro-learning and community platform for credit and collections professionals. This platform offers over 2,500 order-to-cash, treasury, and ERP-specific videos. You can also access skill-focused learning paths on financial statements, treasury, collections, bankruptcies, and many other career growth topics. Along with your team, join the 20,000 strong Highako community today to experience hands-on assessments and quizzes to test your knowledge, get certificates on course completions, and much more. Visit the website academy.hiyako.com and register yourself for free. Highako is spelled Highako, just like it sounds. We also have some exciting news in regard to Highako Academy, as we're launching mini certifications. And we're very excited about this. And what you can do is get certified and earn an exclusive badge by the best-in-class industry experts on critical job skills in just 3 to 5 hours. By taking this mini certification course, you will have exclusive access to checklists, actionable templates, knowledge checks and quizzes, and interactive learning sessions. By the end of the session, we'll provide you with a special early bird discount promo code for the mini certification course. So moving on to today's discussion, I'm pleased to have these 3 panelists with us, experts in their field. First, we have Pam Crank. Pam is president of the credit department, a trade receivables management outsourcing firm that she began in 1992. As a trade receivables management expert, Pam is called on to transform private equity owned, privately held, and publicly traded companies' trade receivables assets into cash. And the idea is to get best in class results doing that. Pam also was also a credit supervisor at a Fortune 100 company for 13 years. For 40 years of global trade credit management experience, working in and consulting with over 600 manufacturers, distributors, and service companies, represent an unparalleled level of experience and expertise in the industry. We're also pleased to have Chris Kuhl. Chris is the managing director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. He provides forecasts and strategic guidance for a wide variety of corporate clients around the world. He is also the economist for several national and international organizations. Chris is the co-author of The Flagship and the Strategic Intelligence System, both publications from Armada. And then last but certainly not least, Paul Hill. Paul is the president of Job Search Intelligence and co-founder of Educate Career. During his career spanning over 20 years, he has implemented and managed product development, marketing, and sales management, and other programs. He has also a guest lectured for MBA entrepreneurship program in the UCLA Anderson School of Management. So let's go ahead and get started.
I'll kick it off. Thanks very much, Dave. My name's
Yeah,
Paul.
and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. My name's Paul Hill. We do, my company JSI, we do actuarial work for student lenders and entities that lend typically to young and thin file borrowers. And as younger folks have weak balance sheets, typically they tend to be a little more vulnerable to weakness in the economy, and they can be a pretty good leading indicator as to what might be coming down the pipeline with respect to changing economic winds. What I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of our observations of the economy over the past year and how we got to where we are right now, because so many people we talk to are a little bit shell-shocked, and they're saying, are we in a recession? Are we in a stagflationary environment? I didn't see this coming. I didn't hear this coming. How did this materialize so quickly? And from where we sit, we really saw the data we're looking at. We saw this coming. We saw this manifesting over the course of the past year. And so I want to give you a timeline of how this evolved. And I'm going to start with Q3 of last year, 2021, July through September timeframe. I'm going to start with basically the business narrative the business media at that time frame was basically telling the world that the economy was recovering quite strongly from the pandemic, that consumers were healthy, businesses were reasonably healthy, and things would move forward in an orderly fashion. At that time, consumer balance sheets were in an incredibly good shape. Savings were at literally all-time highs. And basically, people had received a lot of stimulus checks. Many people didn't have to pay rent or mortgages for a period of months or more, and they hadn't been traveling. So savings literally were at historic highs. One concern of ours, though, during the period of last summer was that inflation, our model was showing that the inflation rate was about 14% for what people actually do spend their income on. And that was an issue of real concern to us. Moving into the fourth quarter of last year, now we're talking the October through December timeframe, the media narrative was essentially the same. Hey, everything's fine. If there is any inflation, it will be transitory and businesses and consumers are healthy. The data we were looking at that time showed us, though, that low-income households by November of 2021, they had already depleted much of their savings. So they had spent through their nest eggs. And middle-income households were depleting their savings at a historic rate. And this is quite concerning. And the implication was that inflation was real and it was eating into people's budgets. Keep in mind at that time frame too, we're talking last fall, November time frame, there were still 3 million fewer people in the full-time workers in the labor market employed than there were at the high water mark of 2019. So we hadn't come close to fully recovering in the labor market, and that was a hit on the economy. Then the last data point from Q4 of 2021, retail holiday sales were down 1.5% from 2019. That's not indicative of healthy consumer or markets. So moving into the start of this year, Q1, January through March, in a period of 6 months only, a record high level of savings had been essentially spent. Low-income households were basically broke at this point in time, and middle-income households had almost entirely spent down their savings. Lower-income households by February, they were putting utility bills on credit cards, and middle-income households were basically increasing their use of credit cards very substantially. So budgets had been depleted, cash budgets had been depleted. They were relying upon debt for income smoothing, and that's expensive debt when it's credit cards, obviously. And inflation essentially was impairing the well-being of household budgets. And if you keep in mind that the US economy is basically 2/3 consumer spending, that's not a good signal for the future. There was another big and alarming signal from the first quarter of this year, and that's that labor productivity was down by 7.4%. And this is something that everybody should have been paying a lot more attention to. This was the worst reading in 75 years. And essentially what was happening is labor costs were way up, and revenues were nowhere near keeping pace. And that's unsustainable, obviously. So moving into the second quarter then of this year, the April through June timeframe, we started to see the first signals of delinquencies and defaults among consumers. And basically it was the younger thin file borrowers, and they were becoming delinquent on auto payments and credit cards and the like. And inflation at that point was still getting worse. We were taking up into the 7, 8, 9% range year over year. Then we finally got a big signal from one of the largest retailers in the world, and that was Walmart in mid-May. If you needed an indication as to how the economy was doing, Walmart came out and issued a statement that said its business was materially affected by inflation. They said their core customer was allocating so much of their budget to gas and food that they had little left over for clothing and household items. And as a consequence, they were going to be discounting those items, and that would lead to a hit on profitability. And the next day, Target said essentially the very same thing. So the media finally acknowledged, and I think the people in the broader business world started to acknowledge, inflation is a real problem. It's affecting consumers severely, and obviously that flows straight into businesses and the health of them. And then closing out Q2 of this year, labor productivity for the second quarter, it was also an absolute disaster. And if you don't have the ability to increase sales, which nobody did at this point in time because consumers were completely constrained, the only other alternative is to get your budget in balance is to reduce costs. And businesses have been doing that primarily by increasing layoffs. Moving into Q3, it's kind of more of the same, and it's not great news. It's obvious that we're in a no growth, high inflation environment, and that's essentially stagflation. And practically speaking, people are getting poorer in real terms. We're also seeing consumer delinquencies, defaults, and bankruptcies. They're ticking up, and they're bleeding up into middle income households now as well. And then business BKs, the data just came out a few days ago, the business bankruptcies have started to tick up in August as well, over prior months. Interest rates obviously aren't helping things at all. A good argument can be made that raising rates in this environment can't bring down inflation at the moment. And the reason being that the current bout of inflation is really a supply side issue or lack thereof. Think about it in these terms: everything in the world economy flows from oil, whether you're in Europe or right here in the US. Energy shortfalls are flowing through the economy and affecting the costs of literally everything from transportation, travel, food, recreation, really pervasive throughout the economy. So a quick look forward. What do we expect? Credit markets are obviously pricing in more bad news. Conversely, the US dollar is actually very strong. And that's helping in many ways. You could basically say that inflation would be a lot worse if the dollar wasn't so strong. We're basically benefiting from buying imported goods with a healthy dollar. Net households, businesses, everybody across the board is recalibrating for declining business activity. Listed companies have been revising their revenue and earnings estimates downwardly for many months now, and few businesses will be immune. So again, everybody is adjusting accordingly. I'm going to pass it off to Chris, and he's going to talk about how this translates into managing credit in a challenging environment.
Very good. Well, I'm probably not going to tell you a whole lot about what you do for a living, because I am, after all, an economist. So what I'm going to try to do is put a little bit of this in context, because Paul hit on a lot of the events that we've looked at over the last couple of years. And by now, we're quite aware of the fact that we have gone through what amounts to 2 black swan events in a row. Everything was completely distorted in 2020. The world had never seen a government-imposed recession in its existence, because this was essentially what it was, trying to deal with COVID, which we didn't understand, still don't really understand. And we ended up doing a lot more damage than we thought we would, which ended up creating problems in 2021. As Paul pointed out, we had an awful lot of savings that had accumulated. We had something like 800 billion in stimulus money pouring into the economy at the same time that you were seeing about 11 trillion coming out of the economy because people had lost their jobs, businesses were going under. That would have been an inflationary factor had it not been for all the firings and the layoffs and the closures. You would have seen that 800 billion making more of an impact, but it was kind of a wash given the amount of money that was coming out of the economy. What was not a wash, and as Paul alluded to, the inflation we're dealing with now has been driven by the supply chain crisis and energy prices. Both of those are essentially kind of variations of that black swan moment. We've ended up with a lot more supply chain disruptions. Generally speaking, when there's a supply shortage environment, there are 2 ways to deal with it. One is to simply not have the product at all, or to raise prices. And what we've seen is price hikes as a way to try to manage that supply disruption. But the disruption is not based on demand. We've got a demand that has been fairly solid throughout 2021. It just couldn't be met, that you had too many interruptions in the overseas supply chain, but also even domestically, which we'll get to in a minute. The oil situation obviously is something that grew out of the invasion that Russia staged in Ukraine. You cannot take the second largest oil producer in the world and essentially isolate them from the market and not have an impact. Much more severe in Europe than it is here, but we're getting the bounce back impact as well. We're shipping a lot of fuel to Europe, which is making our prices higher. What this really ends up meaning for those who are trying to control inflation is that none of their tools work. And that's the comment that Paul was making a minute ago. Raising interest rates, and the central banks have been very blunt about it. They're saying, look, we're raising them because we don't really have any choice. I mean, we're dealing with inflation rates that are at record levels, but don't expect that they have an impact, because this isn't a matter of too much money in the economy. It isn't a matter of monetary policy at this stage. It's a matter of a shortage of energy. That's the disruption of the supply chain. It's the fact that all of these prices have escalated and interest rates are not going to have much of an impact. The dollar has been gaining strength because the Fed was the first of the central banks to get aggressive with its interest rate hikes. As of last week, the other banks are now getting into the act. So the euro is starting to gain a little bit. You're seeing a little bit of movement with the pound, a little bit of movement with some of the other currencies. They're still much weaker than the US, but that period where we were the very, very strongest economy is kind of coming to a bit of an end, because the dollar is going to be coming a little more in line with the other currencies, not because we're weakening, it's just because they'll be strengthening, which to Paul's point means that some of that shipped overseas inflation will be coming back to hit us. Because these are kind of unexpected events, we don't have much of a sense of whether we're going to see an end to this inflation or not. If there was to be a settlement in the Russia-Ukraine situation, which does not look at all likely, but if there was one, the energy sector would change literally overnight. and prices would drop. Some of the estimates have been that the per barrel price would drop by 60 or 70 bucks, literally in a matter of days. How likely is that? At this stage, not very. What are the chances of a recession? A lot of conversation when it was revealed that we had 2 straight quarters of negative growth. That isn't the only thing that NBER looks at. The National Bureau of Economic Research looks at 26 different variables, and one of those is the GDP performance per quarter. But they also look at things like the job market. And right now, that's the one part of the economy that's not behaving in a recessionary manner. We're not seeing a dramatic reduction of staff. Companies are doing some layoffs, but they're not doing anything close to what you'd expect if they were expecting a recession. Part of the reason for this is that it has been so hard to hire for the last several years. Companies are very reluctant to reduce their workforce now. They are finding all kinds of other ways to deal with the situation because they're afraid that if they fire people now, even if it makes perfectly good sense given the economy, they'll never be able to get that workforce back. So they're hanging on much more aggressively than they would under normal circumstances. We still have one of the highest quit rates we've seen in 20 years. We still have a lot of people absolutely convinced that they can find another job if they want it. The unemployment rate is still very low. We're still adding jobs at a rather remarkable level. When that reverses, and it probably will by the end of the year or early next, that will be a signal that we're beginning to see that kind of recessionary atmosphere accelerate. But as long as the job market is behaving that way, we're still a little distant away from a formal recession. And it also encourages the Fed to keep raising rates. They will probably stop raising rates when they start to see a response as far as the employment is concerned. Another thing to keep in mind is that corporate investment is still sitting at high records. Capital spending on robotics, on technology, on expansion to deal with additional inventory, those are still hitting record numbers. We have not seen this kind of corporate investment in decades. Now it's starting to slow down, but it was a reaction to not having the workforce that they needed. So people putting a lot more money into robotics. When you look at how the economy is being affected by sort of people's income, as Paul was pointing out, it's those making 50K or under that are feeling it right now. And they have been feeling it for months. Those that are above 50K, kind of depends on how far above 50K you are. We're kind of at the complain about inflation, but continue on spending stage. We're all noticing the higher prices. It hasn't necessarily changed our habits as much as it probably will. If you look at some of those discretionary spends for the middle income, and I apologize for the noise in the background. This is the joy of doing this from an airport. So those of you who wanted to know how to get to Phoenix, you now know. What we're going to be experiencing, I think, is a period of kind of confused adjustment, waiting to see if we're going to get any sort of relief on the supply chain, some signs that this is taking place, but not particularly rapidly. We're getting a lot more reshoring in the US, but this is not something that's going to be a factor until sometime next year. No real hope on the energy side, although you're seeing a lot of production from countries taking advantage of those higher prices, looking to replace Russia as a supplier to Europe and everybody else. So right now, my attitude has been that we're likely to hit a fairly significant slump and downturn, which really inhabits the latter part of this year, first part of 2023, then begins to push back. We've got a tracking system that has a recovery starting in about second quarter, late second quarter, early third quarter, and then creeping back up. But even as it does, it's going to be a while before it even gets back to 2019 levels. So what the credit manager is going to be dealing with from an economic perspective is a lot of uncertainty. Isn't that fun? Some of your customers are going to be doing quite well. For example, automotive is on fire. It's absolutely not seeing growth like this in decades. The automotive industry, literally right now, every single car that's coming off the line in automotive is pre-sold. It's already sold. The dealers that used to count on having cars on their lot for 3 months or more. We work a lot with auto dealers. The average time on the lot now is 24 hours. And most of them have customers that have been paying for the car, even though they won't get it for another year. They're making payments for 2 years before they have the vehicle that they're making payments on. This is unreal. You know, the numbers that we've seen in automotive are spectacular. On the other hand, the numbers that you're seeing for some of the construction sectors, not very good. Residential is starting to show a decline. You're starting to see some reaction on the entertainment side. To Paul's point, people are having to spend on necessities rather than on discretionary. We're going to watch this year's retail season like a hawk. Halloween is always the beginning of this. Second largest spending holiday in the U.S. calendar now. This will be the 6th year in a row sold children's, for those of you who are keeping up with these things. Then we have Black November, which used to be Black Friday. Now it's the entire month. And then at the very end of the holiday season is where we're going to get a real good look at how successful the American male is at saving Christmas. What we tend to do is pretend that Christmas is not going to be on the 25th, so we don't start spending until like 2 days before Christmas. The Retail Federation has studied, and they realize that 50% of what men buy in the last 2 days before Christmas is purchased at a convenience store. So for people who have received a 6-pack and a package of Slim Jims as a Christmas present, you now know why. So we're going to be watching that behavior as well. So I think Paul has a good point. We're in a circumstance not exactly like we dealt with in 2008, because that was a more traditional kind of financial sector driven recession. We're still trying to work through the weirdness of both 2020 and 2021. We were inevitably going to see a slowdown this year simply because we grew so fast last year. We were growing at a 6% rate. We had to come down from that, but we've kind of exceeded that decline. We were probably headed maybe to a 2.5, 3% growth. Now it's looking that 2023, maybe 2%, maybe 1.5%, short of being in an absolute recession, but still a downturn. And that actually makes it harder for the credit sector, because it's not like everything is in a state of collapse. Some sectors will be, some sectors won't be. And it's going to be a matter of trying to figure out where your clients are and how they're fitting into both the supply chain crisis as it exists and how it's going to be repaired. So just as an advance warning, if I have to abruptly jump off and leave, it's because my plane is threatening to leave without me. So I will hang in here as long as I can, and we'll just see what goes from there. Thanks very much.
Chris, let me just give you a follow-up question. On September 6th, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article about leveraged loans, and frankly, the size of corporate debt is extremely high. And of course, that's with primarily public companies. And then yesterday, we had the stock market drop 1,000 points because inflation rate was higher than expected. And
right,
obviously, that means more rate increases from the Fed, and then more downgrading of these loans by other people. Can you talk about the corporate debt issue a little bit?
Yeah, the corporate debt situation has been really fragmented, because you've got some sectors that have been basically trying to stay afloat through debt. So a lot of that corporate debt has been concentrated in kind of the entertainment sector, the travel sector, the hospitality sector, the retail services sector. A lot of the manufacturers and even in construction and transportation, they actually accumulated money in the last couple of years and have not been turning to debt as religiously as they have in the past. They've made a lot of money. Manufacturing did quite well during 2020 because people couldn't spend their money on services and they spent it on stuff. So they ended up buying a lot more manufactured goods, and you're seeing manufacturing sectors like automotive growing very quickly. So it's kind of a division of the business community when it comes to debt. The market again rallied today after crashing yesterday. And part of the challenge when they were responding to the inflation numbers was that they were accepting that the non-core rates were going to go up. They were shocked that the core rate had gone up. But I look at that and I'm going, you do understand, folks, that core and non-core eventually merge. I mean, they don't stay separate forever. You know, the non-core is going to pick up the price of fuel, but core is going to pick up airline tickets and freight rates. And the other thing that was making a big splash as far as the economy was concerned was the threat of an imminent freight rail strike, which has now been authorized and could start as soon as September 29th. You've still got a strike decision being made by the ILWU on the docks. So if we've got an inflation problem that's driven by supply chain, just imagine how much fun it's going to be when there's no more freight rail and there's nobody unloading container ships at the ports. And it's like, okay, now the last time we had a strike with the ILWU, it cost the economy $70 billion in 3 weeks. So we're
Well, and the thing
sincerely
that's
hoping.
happening, yeah, the thing that's happening with that is they're not accepting new freight at this point. You know, they're trying to get it out of the system. So,
Absolutely.
that brings back the inventory and supply chain problems. So,
Yeah,
to your
exactly.
point,
So
let me just try to summarize. So you need to watch your industries. You need to watch also your geographies, I think. Europe's going to be different from here. And you need to see, where your dollars at risk are.
Right. Exactly. And the real challenge is that, again, if you go back to more traditional recessions, go back to 2008, it was a pretty safe bet to just kind of look at everybody and say, everybody's in trouble. I need to watch everybody. I need to be extremely cautious. I need not to do anything. Well, now you're looking at some sectors that are like, why are you picking on me? I'm fine. I'm doing great. Look at my numbers. I mean, for crying out, so the credit manager is now going to have to do a lot more judgment calls. They're going to have to say, yeah, okay, I can see where this part of the economy is really hurting, but this other part of the economy is doing quite well, and that's going to be both regional and industry wide. A lot of the data that I've been getting from small to medium manufacturers, they're still pounding away on capital development because they've basically given up on trying to find workers. So they're just going full on robotic and even if they can't necessarily afford it, and they're using the windfall that they made the last couple of years. I mean, the service sector is robotic. I had my first experience with a robot server at a restaurant. Comes rolling up to my table, asked me if I ordered that breakfast, and asked me to sample my coffee to see if it was the right temperature. And if it wasn't, it was going to hustle back to the kitchen and get me another cup. I mean, I haven't had a server ask me if I'm satisfied in the last 5 years, but this robot actually seemed to care.
Well, maybe it was looking for a big tip.
Well, I left it some spare batteries. I mean, that's all I could think of to tip a robot, so.
That's all very interesting. So that, I think, is a good way to segue into, some of the strategies in terms of managing credit risk. So let's start with this first question, and I'm going to ask Pam to respond. So managing credit risk against the backdrop of an economic downturn, we see it's a complex challenge. And so let's get down to the credit department level, Pam. How should the departments define a risk strategy based on all this?
Well, we're hoping it's not too much of a complex challenge, because we credit people should have been able through the good times to decipher what it takes to be a good risk from a poor risk. And I think the credit risk strategy should be to shore up the resources you're using now, the automation that you're using, in order to watch all of these different risks. I think we have 300,000 build to customers in our portfolio, and you obviously cannot eyeball 300,000 customers. So you have to know what you're looking at through data. I'm always amazed that people do this manually still. They don't automate much of the receivables management, but I think if we look at the strategy, we have to make sure that we've got good data, that this information is making sense, that it's actually helping us predict what's going on, what is happening within an industry, within a customer base, within specific businesses, that we should have been doing all along. The problem was before it was sort of this fake strength issue because so many companies had took so much cheap debt on. So to Chris's point, it wasn't across the board. Some companies did very, very well being able to store cash and pay down debt. But we work in a lot of industries where there's a tremendous amount of debt that these companies have. And we used to, as an example, we used to take in our scorecard, we would bundle people's cash balances with their availability on their credit lines and use that to help us determine how much risk to take. And now, in the last couple of months, to Paul and Chris's points here, as we go into a tougher period, is we have separated that now and said, how much cash does the company actually have versus how much debt availability do they have on their credit lines? A lot of our customers, our clients' customers are very reliant on those credit lines to continue. So we are monitoring things like, when do these lines expire? Are we able then to find out when they're going to be renewed and how long they're renewed for? And even what are the terms of the agreement? Now that debt has gotten so much more expensive, we know that it pushes some of these customers over the edge in terms of what they can afford. So we're really watching cash positions very, very strongly. We have a certain dollar threshold that anything over that, we have to have bank information. Financials are nice, but I'm not going to get paid off of inventory. I'm not going to get paid off of buildings. I'm going to get paid based on how much cash these companies have. And I look at it the way Paul looks at the consumer side of business, that consumers had all of this money and then they started spending it. That's what companies are doing. And so how much, what is their run rate in terms of how long their cash is going to last? I'm not in the long-term credit business. I'm not so concerned what happens to this business in a couple of years. I care about what's going to happen in my 30, 60, 90 day decision that has to be made in terms of what kind of terms are we going to grant and how much credit are we going to grant. So I should have been doing this all along, but if credit managers have sort of had some simple scorecards without digging deep into the cash position of the company, I think they really have to look at that strategy and think, what do we really know about how much cash this customer has available and how much they're burning through? Because a lot of my fellow entrepreneurs took a lot of that cash out too. When they were making the money, they took the money out. So how well will that business weather that storm? So hopefully the strategy is to stay on top of the customer base. Maybe there's a certain dollar amount like we do, risk levels based on average days to pay, and maybe less reliant on what other people are doing, what other creditors are doing. You don't want to go over the cliff with all these other people. You really want to be the first to know that something's going on with your customers. So I would say making those changes now, if you haven't been watching them carefully, because everyone could get cheap debt. It sounds like, things are going to be a little bit rockier. Make sure you know what that cash position is.
Yeah, we haven't been in an interest rate environment like this since I started in credit back in the late 70s and early 80s. And that, receivables lose their value a lot quicker when interest rates are high, and going up. And we've been able to manage things differently. And I think credit managers are going to need to, change their focus a little bit. Would you care to comment on that a little more? I guess the other point is, a lot of those loans that they have are interest rate based. I know my home equity line is, and my monthly payments have gone up a little bit in the last 2 months. And I'm sure they're seeing some of that on their credit positions.
Absolutely. We're seeing those changes already in the way we're scoring our customers, our corporate customers. It's making a big difference with interest rate increases, especially those that are heavily in debt. If they're not a public company, they have to go back to their private equity funders or their lending officers for increases. We're hearing things like, I'm working on it with my bank. We tell them, we need to talk to the lender. If we're going to give increases, we need to know, because these decisions happen fairly quickly, generally speaking. And if they're shopping banks, one thing we did in 2019 was, or 2009, is we looked at which banks they were at, because we had a lot of high interest debt out there in banks that are more expensive for these businesses to deal with. So we knew they were paying higher rates in order to do that. So we started rating the banks of the customers as well. So I really think that we've got to be paying much, much more attention to the trends that are going on in the cost of this debt. Because Chris is right, we have people who are really cash heavy. They've been able to save a ton of money that they were making. Our manufacturers are doing really well. It's the manufacturers' customers that are really suffering right now. So we're paying an awful lot of attention to what's going on with those interest rates.
Paul, do you have anything to add?
Not on.
Okay, so let's move on. With recession fear rising, many customers may end up filing for bankruptcy. We've talked about that. So how can creditors mitigate their AR risk with secured transactions?
Well, we do a lot of strategies when we're dealing with a high-risk customer. So every credit department should have risk codes attached to customers. So they know their high-risk portfolio, they can pull it up, they know the delinquency rate, they know how much they have in the receivable. So what we're looking for is, how do we mitigate the risk in this high-risk category? The ones who we're not so worried about, we can put those aside. But the ones that we know are at high risk of default, we're looking at things like filing UCC filings. We do mechanics liens. We are trying to find ways to tie them to stronger companies where we can, through cross-corporate guarantees. Not a huge fan of a personal guarantee unless we also have personal financial statements, but we find a lot of these small companies, they'll sign 10 personal guarantees. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to just get a personal guarantee. I love the lien business. We use NCS to follow our liens when we don't get paid and we have physical property that we can lien. We also work in service businesses that do a lot of liens. And you think, well, how does that work? Well, in our lab business, where we sell to dentists who have not paid us, we are very interested in getting them on payment notes where it allows us to secure the debt. So we may not have had that through the credit process because it's a very quick sale, usually smaller balances, but when they get very past due, now we're interested in having them sign a note, right? That says, this is our balance and here's how we're going to pay. So what we want to do is we want to be able to have them come in and sign a secured note where we now have filed a UCC agreement against their assets. And if that dentist tries to take that practice and sell it, well, they have to pay us off first. So we'll get a lot of calls the night before a close in a sale to say, we have a lien on this business, we need the lien removed. And we'll say, oh, great, you can wire us $14,800 and we'll remove the lien. And we had nothing on these assets prior because we're selling them services, but we used a payment note as a way to secure a debt when a customer went into the high risk category for us. So that's one way that we did that. Now, we do have a lot of red flags that we look for. Federal tax liens, number one in the US. We look for those federal tax liens as a sign that they are in deep trouble. The IRS gives you plenty of time, plenty of opportunity to set up payment plans. And so we know that that's a huge issue for companies when we see those. Slowness in payments is a lagging indicator for us. They'll pay the people they have to pay and let the small ones go. So we're not paying a whole lot of attention to that because that happens way after the fact. But our red flags usually come from our cash information sources, meaning the banks. We are looking for the banks to tell us if they've got overdrafts, NSF checks, if those balances are going down. Those are some of the red flags we're looking for. So we want to be the first creditor, unsecured almost always, creditor to know that this company is in trouble. So that generally will happen through some type of tax lien or banking notice on the cash flow problems that these companies are having.
Pam, do you establish a relationship with the bankers so you can pick up on that information? What do you do there? Because that's always been well, in more recent years, it's been harder and harder to get comments from the banks.
That's a good question. In the US, we don't really have problems getting bank information. Canada is a pain because Canadian banks will only allow you to get a reference through a US bank or another Canadian bank. So they're a little more difficult. In Europe, we have that similar problem. But in the US, yes, we actually talk to a lot of bankers. We have one person in particular in our credit group who talks to bankers pretty much all day long. The bankers, once they know you, when you do it for the first time, it's very easy to get the information ongoing. Some banks can be very difficult, like Wells Fargo makes you fill out their form. The customer has to fill out their form to allow for a bank reference. So we follow whatever rules those banks have to get the information. It's the most valuable piece of data we have to know how much credit to grant a customer. So we do what it takes. We pay for that information through third parties like confirmation.com, Bank VOD, wherever that bank contributes. So we are very, very interested in what that bank has to say. But you're right, Dave, we do have relationships with banks where we know how to get that information as well.
Very interesting. Let's move on. In the absence of standardized credit approval workflows, and so a typical company that's doing this manually and has different people doing it, different people are going to interpret the risk data differently, and so you're not going to get consistent decisions.
Yeah.
What are the best tools for facilitating that, and then for getting the right decisions, and then putting the proper security in place with that?
Well, first of all, we don't have everybody do credit. I think that's a mistake. I know it's a mistake we see in a lot of credit departments is they hire a bunch of generalists who do a little bit of collections, a little bit of dispute management, a little bit of credit. That's not a very efficient process. We centralize the credit decisions. Also, our credit people are more expensive than our collectors. They usually have finance degrees, MBAs, highly certified people. So they just make credit decisions and they understand how to follow the scorecards to make a decision so that our decisions are consistent. Now, of course, we work in a lot of different industries. Our commodity business, for example, you cannot ship a truckload of product out of a commodity business without confirming bank information. They will not allow anything to go. So that's a very, very tight credit policy. We work in service businesses like that dental business where they don't get credit applications. They just do business with most of the dental practices, and then they have a very strict collection policy. So the credit score is based on the risk tolerance of that particular company and how much risk they actually want to take. So we start there, and the decisions follow a scorecard. So the scorecard will tell you how much risk of default there appears to be and how much credit to grant. So it's not a lot of interpretation unless you miss a key piece of data. Again, we do try to secure any of our, we work in the ag business where we are shipping products, steel products to farm sites. So we will file pre-liens on that product to let those farmers know, say, if we don't get paid, we're going to file a lien on your property. We're the car wash business, so we do the same thing in the car wash business, that we've got a piece of property to lien. So mechanics liens for me have so much power. We always get paid with mechanics liens if we do it right. Again, we use NCS for that to follow along the projects. Anytime you have that opportunity, same thing in public jobs, we get all the bonding information before we do the work. So a lot of that hard credit work has to be done before you let the shipment go. So you've got the information that you need. So those are going to be the best tools that we use for that. The applications are great to get the credit applications, maybe personal guarantees on the small businesses that you're selling to, but a lot of it is looking for what security we can do. It's not a common thing. I would say we secure about 15% of our portfolio is actually secured. So 85% of it goes without security.
And is that larger credits that you're gonna tend to secure more often, I would assume?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, we're looking at, almost everything that we're doing up front is going to be for jobs that are major jobs, 5, 6 figures, 7 figures in some cases. But sometimes we have to do it after the fact. Just like I said, we lien the assets of a dental practice, even though we provided a service that was long done. We do that an awful lot through the payment notes to secure, and those can be any amount, but I believe, I shouldn't say that, the minimum amount that we do that, because there's a cost of filing the liens is $5,000. So anything above $5,000 that we have to put a customer on a payment note, meaning they didn't pay us on time and they're too far behind to just write us a check for the entire past due, then we will file liens when they sign the notes. Some of the savvier owners will cross off our UCC writing that we put in really tiny letters so they don't read it. They'll still go through and cross them off. But for the most part, we're able to file the lien based on a payment note on something that had nothing to do with what we plan to lien. So there, 5,000 is the minimum.
Yeah, and just to step back again, your recommendation that credit analysis needs to be specialized and not spread out among everybody is, I think, spot on. You need to need a separation of duties if you're going to have higher performance in the credit department, and
That's right.
it's also going to help you better manage risk. And the other thing with risk is it tends to get concentrated. So you're applying security to the higher dollar transactions, and
That's right.
those are going to be the majority of your AR portfolio. So if you do a portfolio analysis,
Yep.
and I've done this going into companies as a consultant, the 80-20 rule, or it's very often more like 90-10, is there's
Yep.
a small number of companies that are accounting for all the most of the receivables, and therefore that's where most of the risk is, not so much with the 80% that constitute all the smaller guys.
That's right.
We spend too much time with them sometimes.
Yeah, we do. We do. Yeah, you really have to know where to focus that. And we have 30 people here, 30 analysts, collectors, and credit analysts, and deduction specialists. I certainly do not want to have to train somebody on how to recognize in a financial statement, for example, what they're looking at in the cash flow from operations. They need to come to me with that, and those aren't going to be the people making the collection calls for the most part. That skill set is very, very different. And so we never want that spread out so thin among 30 people either. I want it concentrated within my very educated, very well-trained credit analysts who know what they're looking for over and over again as they're doing these credits throughout the day.
Okay, we're gonna take a break at this point and do a little bit of a poll. And so what we want to ask you as our audience is which of the following would be useful for securing your transactions: a blanket filing, collaterals and liens, or a purchase money security instrument. So blanket filing, collateral and liens, a PMSI, please make your choice. And if two of them are important to you, pick the one that's most important, please. And so we give you a chance for a little bit to do that. And while we're doing that, we're gonna let that continue for a bit more here. And give it another 15 seconds. And we'll see what we have. Okay, 5 seconds to wrap it up. So if you haven't clicked now, click now. Click before, click now, forever hold your peace. Let's see what we've got on the results. So it's a lot of interest in collateral and liens, obviously. And then blanket filings a little bit ahead of purchase money security. So that's interesting, and we'll keep that in mind as we go through this. What want to just mention something else to you in light of our new launch of these mini certifications. We want to give you a little information about that. So the certification program that we're offering was designed by Jerry Bailey of NCS, and he has over 25 years of consulting experience on UCC filing, and it will provide you all with the different steps you should take to protect your unsecured credit. And there's a variety of content inside this mini certification program. As you can see on the slide, we have modules, checklists, ready-to-use templates, quizzes, and they're all part of the program. It's all self-paced. And after completing the mini certificate course, you're going to get a skill badge and a certificate. And it's something that you can show on your social media profiles and share with your employer. And it's a little way of acknowledging what you've accomplished in your dedication to the credit profession and learning more. So we hope you'll participate, and we'll have that code for you at the end of this presentation. So moving along to the next question, as credit managers, how can we leverage stakeholders who are in direct contact with our customers to reduce AR risks and improve collectibility? First people I think of here are sales, and but there's other stakeholders as well that we probably should be leveraging.
Yeah, it depends on who's, I guess, close to the customer, the kinds of things that we can use those people for to talk to the customer about what we need, especially when we're not able to make the recommendation for credit to a customer because of different situations. A lot of times this is where we'll try to tie them through a cross corporate guarantee, maybe to a stronger sister company, something that we have the ability to find a way to make the deal with sales and marketing and the groups that are involved. We have a lot of credit committees that we're on with our clients to make these types of decisions, and they're all stakeholders in that. The CEO, the CFO, the VPs, they really want to know how can we get the deal done, but know that we're going to get paid. So that negotiation is so much easier to do before you do the deal than after the fact. It's very hard then to get a customer to give you information. And again, big fan of telling them that we can go over the bank information with them, talk to the lender together. We do an awful lot of that. On a lot of these deals, they may not want us to talk to the lender, but they'll send us their bank statements. So they'll just send it to us in the credit department on confidentiality agreements so that we don't discuss with sales, but we are very frank with sales about why the customer didn't qualify and some of the options, because it is our job to say yes, but it's our job to say yes, but here's what we need in order to make the deal. If all we do is say no, then we're gonna be one of those people that Chris was talking about, may not have jobs at the end of the year or the first part of next year. We've got to be out there making deals, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I was interviewing somebody on the economy and related topics, and he made the point that sales promotions, which as many people may not realize are a huge component of the whole selling expense, and
Right.
probably the largest part of that. And that, you know, you should be looking at your customers in conjunction with sales for that very reason, because why should you be giving a promotion to someone that's a high risk? And,
That's exactly right. Yep, we do go through that with the marketing departments. That's an excellent point. The same way that we look at the pricing of the product, we learned this from the bankers decades ago. They don't give the same rate to every company who comes in and wants to borrow money, right? You pay more if you're higher risk to them. So we do the same thing and say, what are we going to take in exchange for this risk? And that's where we get into the pricing model, the marketing offers. It's insane that these companies don't look at the risk of default or risk of slow pay when they go out and give these marketing offers. We're the ones who have to do the cleanup on the marketing offers, so we know what a mess it is when they're going in and doing that. And another issue is they don't read the contracts. So they get a contract from one of these big retailers that's 45 pages, nobody bothers to read it. And they don't see how these guys make money with all their fines and their late shipment fees and everything else that they come back to us with. That's a cost of doing business. And why would you give your best customers the same offers that you give your high risk customers who you might end up with a bankruptcy in, and you gave them these best rates? It makes absolutely no sense to me, but we see it over and over again. And again, credit then is not tied to the pricing and sales decision. There's a disconnect there in a lot of companies.
yeah, absolutely. I've seen that as well. Scoring models. So how should credit grantors deploy scoring models in order to minimize credit risk exposure? What can you do in terms of using these models to rank your customers and make decisions, Pam?
Oh boy, that's a whole nother class.
That is, isn't it?
There's a lot to a scoring model, but I think the big thing is the consistency in using the model throughout. Now, that doesn't mean it's the same scorecard. Even within the same company, we have multiple scorecards for one client sometimes, because it depends on the customer market they're selling into as to what that scorecard model is going to look like. But you really need to be looking at things like public records, where we always go to LexisNexis for our public records. We don't rely on credit reporting out there because it's so haphazard. So we want comprehensive information on public records like liens and judgments on bankruptcies. So that's an essential element of every scorecard we have. It's the only essential element of all of our scorecards is public records. So we want to know that. We want to be able to get to the dollar amount, right? How much credit do we want to extend? You've got to really look at their cash position. How much cash do they have? If you think about it in Paul's consumer markets, are you going to sell a Tesla to one of these kids who is 20 years old and going to have to make $1,200 car payments and they just got their first job? Probably not. Or you're going to have them pay 2/3 of it up front before you release the rest of it. The commercial market is exactly the same. What can this company afford to buy from you? And how do we set that line based on their cash availability. It seems really basic, but because people don't want to go through the effort of finding out what cash positions are, they just sort of look at other creditors and go, you know, they're giving them 100, we'll give them 100. And that's really a lazy way to grant credit. Paul, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there. You know, we built scoring models, and the failure of our models is always caused by human intervention and overriding the model. Somebody decided to make a decision, a goodwill decision, typically, and no malice intended. They thought they were doing the right thing, and they take a haircut as a consequence.
Right.
For many months now, we've had our clients asking us, where should I pull in? And this gives us an opportunity to have sort of an intellectual discussion and gain information and have a productive debate with our clients. We say, well, where do you think you should pull in? And it gives us an opportunity to discuss the functions of the model with the customer, and it causes them to not get lazy. And what you were kind of hinting, Pam, is people get lazy. They'll call another bank and say, well, what are those guys doing? What are those guys doing? And that happens so frequently. And if a person is forced to do their homework and think about the decision rigorously as opposed to emotionally, then generally they rely on the model as opposed to deviating from the model. And
That's right.
And then it can do its job.
That's true.
Yeah.
No one knows overriding like a credit manager. We're overridden all day long. And, you know, I always tell credit managers, this isn't a failure on your part. It's the lack of a division between a credit recommendation, which is based purely on these facts, right? And then a business decision that gets made because they need to sell this product. It's sitting in the warehouse, they need to get rid of it. That's not a credit decision. The credit decision is based on these objective sets of data. This is what we're going to recommend. And companies make business decisions all the time. And we understand that in credit. So we have to sort of step back from this, hey, we're being overridden yet again, and understand that they're making a decision based on other things. You hope that they're also mitigating that risk. Doesn't usually happen, but we do our job by looking at all this objective data and giving a credit recommendation. So you're absolutely right, that overriding, it happens to all of us credit people. When something goes bad, then guess what? We are the ones to clean up the mess too. Right. We have to spend all that time on a bankruptcy that we said you should have never sold to these people. And it's very hard not to say, I told you so, at least a few times a week. So we really hold our tongue. But it's that objective information in our scorecards that's really, really critical to this.
That's a great distinction, Pam. And a lot of that will depend on the type of product you're selling. If you're selling lettuce, it's going to spoil in a few days. And if you don't sell it, it's going to be a loss anyway. So sometimes you've got to take a lot more risk based on the type of inventory that you're selling. You know, and other people that have products that are in demand, you're in a different position then. And you should have different business decisions made. And yeah, very good point. The other thing too with scoring models is just let me make a little distinction here. You've been talking about scorecards and basically, you know, something to rate the customer and provide some point of a comparison between your customers and along the lines of determining how much credit should I give them. But then there's other scoring models that we get from the Bureau, which are predictive models based on risk. And so D&B's commercial credit score or Experian Intelligence score. And I don't know what everybody else calls their scores, but they all have one. Generally predict delinquency within the next year, or or chance of going beyond terms 90 days within the next year, something like that. And that can be used differently to take a look at your portfolio. Would you care to comment about that distinction?
Sure. I'm not a fan of those scores. We have tracked them over time. I hope DMB isn't sponsoring this session. Over
You're safe.
time, we've tracked those. Oh, thank you, Michelle. We've tracked those, and they really haven't mattered a whole lot. And I think it's because by the time they say it's a lousy score, the whole world knows it's a lousy score. That they kind of take the worst and put them in there. I don't find them all that predictive, because they are showing trends of how creditors are paid, and not like all creditors, a very small subsection of creditors. But I know it's a huge moneymaker for the bureaus out there. I get it. People buy it because they don't write their own scorecards. That's my opinion, is we create our own scores based on the objective data that we research ourselves. We get that information. It's not reactive information. It's stuff that's going on right now, not saying that, hey, this, here's what we think is going to happen over time. We're looking at this information, not how they pay creditors. That might slow down 90 days from now. We're looking at a bounce check the guy made yesterday, and that the bank is reporting it. So I know people do it again because it's easier. They can take these scores and put them in there, but all the studies I've done in these 600 companies, I've never, ever seen those to be predictive in terms of what actually goes. Now, in a commercial market, that's because, too, it's not telling us anything from a financial standpoint until it's really too late. And so that's the problem I have with scoring, is I don't think that anybody does any primary research if they rely on the scorecards of a commercial business. It's only going to be those companies that report. It's not like consumers, where they're gathering everything that person is doing. We have a very small percentage. I think it's less than 10% of creditors that are reporting into those bureaus. So I have a problem with
it's actually less than 3%.
Oh, it's smackdown. It's
Right.
worse than I thought.
Yeah.
Yes, but
Oh, yeah.
no, but I think your points are right on. I think they have use with again, the small customers, but I think
Yes.
I wouldn't use a
Yes.
credit score with a large customer at all.
No.
But yeah, if you have a lot of small transactions, you need to make decisions quickly.
Right.
And
Yeah,
let's face it,
throw
you're
your
not going to get a
bag.
big hit if you're wrong. Then the scorecards can save you a lot of time and effort. I mean, the scoring models, the predictive scoring models, as opposed to a scorecard. But yeah,
I
I
think
just wanted
Paul's got a
to
few
I
thoughts
wanted
on
to
it.
bring out that distinction, and I'm glad you did.
Just a
Yeah,
quick
I'd love to
comment
get,
there.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Quick comment there. Yeah, with respect to what you're saying, Pam, I think it's so true, and there's an old saying in conjunction with this, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. And, it's just ass covering. And, a person pulls a DNB report or whatever it may be. There's no due diligence there. They didn't do the hard work. And what you're talking about is the hard work. It's not fun. It's a pain, but it's the only real due diligence that is timely and valid. And what, a lot of the commentary with respect to these scoring models, we know the shortcomings because we build them. And, we tell our clients, we're very forthright in saying this thing is going to be wrong at some point in time in the future. I just don't know when it's going to be wrong, and I don't know with whom. and it's true, but they need some structure. And
Right.
so this gives them a good a good model is honest. Okay. And, but it gives them some structure and a foundation in their decisioning process. And then management needs to put guardrails in place to say, okay, you don't go outside of these boundaries or what have you. But in terms of the predictive abilities, you know, there's 100 people in a room, you know, something's going to happen to 3 of them. You just don't know which 3.
Right. Right.
So,
All right, well, let's move on to the last question. And, you know, we've talked about a lot of things today, and so this will help sum things up is, you know, what parameters or what steps should creditors have in mind when adjusting their credit policies to deal with an economic downturn? If you haven't already started changing your policies, you probably should be. And so,
Right.
Pam, what should they be doing?
Yeah, you take that credit policy off the shelf and you blow off, you know, 2 inches of dust, and you start reading it and saying, what's in there? What is it saying? How much risk tolerance should we be taking? You have that conversation with the CFO. We do it. I have dozens of CFOs I work for. And we say, how much risk do you want to take right now? You tell us what you want to do. What is your strategy so that I can adjust the scoring that I'm doing now to say, this makes sense. That I can, maybe before I really wasn't interested in the cash position because I had a whole bunch of small customers and that would have been really expensive to spend $25 on every bank reference. But now I've got this group of customers, maybe in a particular industry that isn't doing very well. And I know that one of these is going to pop. So I want to look at my policy and say, how do we treat this group of customers so that we can mitigate the risk, so that we can change our scorecard, because that's most likely where my default is going to happen. So I think we have to update what we have, but not in a simplistic way. We really need to look at that portfolio and say, where are my concerns? When we can go into business and turn everything over to a mechanics lien process on the risk, we give endless lines of credit to these little contractors working in their trucks. Because if they don't pay us, I now own a farm in Aberdeen. So I realize that I can take that risk, and that client loves that because I've got security. So we've got to be thinking in terms of which pockets in the economy are going to be the riskiest. Where are people, where are these companies that really are burning through cash? And then create a scorecard or a policy just around those markets. And not be so concerned about the 100,000 customers we have, because if you lose 1,000 here, 2,000 here, it's probably not going to kill you. But look at these big risks and what kind of information do you have in your portfolio right now for those big risks? How many of them can you secure? How many of them do you have the ability to lessen your risk? And I think that's what we have to do going into this downturn, is identify who those are, what market they're in, and then how are we going to treat existing customers? Because most of our losses don't come from the new guys, because you're doing all the due diligence, right? They're coming in and you're hearing people like Pam Crank say, do your due diligence, get your information. But the guys you've been selling to for 20 years, sales is saying, oh, you've been selling them for 20 years. They're good for it. Well, no, Junior just took the company over and he's spending that money like wildfire. It's going out the door. You need to be able to know which of these customers you really have to focus on. And most times they'll come from your existing customer base, in my experience.
Well, if you take a look at the Census Bureau on business startups and closures, you'll see that that's exactly true. So yes, a lot of startups do fail, but it's not disproportionate to the number of businesses that fail after their first couple of years. And
we wouldn't have given them credit anyways, Dave. If they're
Yeah.
a startup, you know, cash, COD, cash in advance.
Well, the banks sure don't loan them anything. Yeah, so just before we move to the Q&A, Paul, do you have any final thoughts to add?
Yeah, I would also just add to what Pam's saying there. I would also encourage you folks to take a macro look at what's going on in the economy. And there is a treasure trove of data out there. Go into the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and a couple things to pay attention to. Write this down. The JOLTS data, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. It's a really good, reliable signal as to the health of an industry sector. If there are layoffs in your industry or an industry you're selling into, probably your clients are not immune. There might be a few that are immune. They're all going to tell you they're immune, but not all of them are immune. Take a look at these data and get familiar. It's very informative, very enlightening. It will give you a macro view of what's going on in your industry, and you can go back decades and look at the perturbations in the data. You can look at the trends and get a sense of, oh wow, hey, my industry has shrunken over some years, or it's been growing at a nice clip, or what have you, in terms of total employment. But following the layoff data, quits is interesting. Quits tells you people within the industry, the employees are feeling quite bullish, and it's usually indicative of a healthy industry. Layoffs are speaking volumes about the lack of health within an industry, and it's and they're pretty timely. If the bosses are laying people off, they're on the front edge of smelling they're having trouble. Right?
Yeah, good point. There's just so much information available now, and that's part of what I do at Credit Today, try to identify some of these things, and that's a great one to look at. And a lot of this information that comes from the government is industry specific too, so you can break out the different industries, which is all very good, useful stuff.
Absolutely.
So we've answered a few questions that have been asked during the course of this without directly responding to them. But if you have any more questions, now's the time to do it, because we're coming to the close here. And, so get them in quickly. I'm going to actually move on to the last few items. Here's your promo code. For the, pardon me, I'm having a senior moment here. Here's your promo code for the new certificate program. So please look at that. Also, we'd appreciate it if you'd give us your feedback. There's a link in the Zoom chat for that, so please click on that link and tell us what you think about this session. The next session coming up is Learn the Ropes, International Credit Laws, Regulations, and Incoterms. That'll be at 1 p.m. Central Time tomorrow. And I hope I have the right day on that. Today, the 14th. I don't know what day it is anymore. It's things have been so busy. Anyway, so don't miss out on the sessions that we have. We have sessions tomorrow and which is Thursday, and Friday as well. I at least know that today is Wednesday, which reminds me of the movie. If it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. And I don't see any other questions that have come in. So let me just say that close this up. I want to thank everybody, all our participants. Thank you for Paul and Pam. We appreciate your feedback. We thank him as well, but he's probably on a plane by now. Hopefully it hasn't been canceled. And you know, if you have any questions, email us at mikeyakimchuk@highako.com. We'll put that up in the chat, and we'll get back to you. And the materials for this session, as well as the recordings, will be live on highako.com very soon. And anybody who's registered will be sending those to you. Again, thank you for coming. We hope this has been informative, and we appreciate you spending your time with us. This is Dave Schmidt for Credit Today, signing off.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Pam.
Thank
Have a great
you.
afternoon, everyone.
You too.